We spoke of the two spies that went in, and I think we got into a little bit the crossing of the crossing the Jordan. The priest took the ark and stood out in the middle of the Jordan until the whole nation of Israel had crossed, and they all had to pass the ark, and then the priest brought the ark out, and the river returned to its natural banks, natural flow. This was, of course, been the spring of the year, pretty high water, but so they had crossed, but now they're on the other side. I brought our plane along here. We don't have our too much, but see, the Jordan River comes down here, and you got the Dead Sea kind of here, and here would be, can you see that good enough? This kind of, well, right in here would be Mount Nebo, where God took Moses up right before his death, and he got to see all the land of Canaan, kind of a supernatural panoramic view that God granted him before he died. And this is where God buried Moses himself there. And then Jericho would have been just on the other side of the Jordan River, and that's 825 feet below sea level. It's really the lowest point of any continuous inhabitants upon the face of the earth. And Jerusalem would be on west of here, maybe a little bit to the southwest, a little bit here. So this is just kind of where our geographical location is. Now Jericho itself was right there, but it was kind of the way I take it, the city itself was kind of built on a mound, and around the outside of Jericho, you had say that's roughly walls of Jericho right there, and all around here would have been a perimeter retaining wall built of stone, probably about 8 feet high, and then right on the inside of this would have been a wall about probably about 24 feet high, and it would have been made of dried mud bricks, very similar to what the Israelites would have made when they were in the land of Egypt. And it had been, like I said, about 24 foot tall probably, and several feet thick. And then inside of that, at a higher level, was another wall, same thing, about 24 foot high, earthen bricks. And this would have been like a higher plateau. Probably 50% greater land area in this than what all this would have been around here. Probably not drawing the scale here. But then here on the outer wall, there had been homes and shops and stuff all built against this wall, and there would have been windows in the wall for light and ventilation. So the back wall of your house, if you live here, the back wall of your house would actually have been the wall of the city. And the poorer class of people would have lived here in this first level and the lower level. Up here on the upper level, the plateau would have been the ruling class, and just your richer class of people probably. This area here would, if you lived up here on the top level, would have been more secure. Just from a safety standpoint, and just a little nicer place to live, probably. Rahab would have lived here in this lower level, and her house was against the wall here, as we know. Probably the first thing I noticed when we started to study the Old Testament, I don't know how long it's been, time gets away, but the first thing I know, whenever you start doing research, is the intense bias, anti-biblical bias in archaeology. That's the first thing you run into. It's almost overwhelming. All the archaeological work that's done within the last 100 years seems to want to disprove the biblical account. That's not true of archaeological work done primarily before that. But in the 1900s, it became the idea that the biblical account is just fiction, and everything that they find in archaeological digs, they seem to slant to discredit the Word of God. And this pretty much coincides with the evolution theory that became prominent, which was around before that, became prominent in society and in education about that same time during the 1900s, or going back to the 1930s, 1920s, 100 years ago. We'll say the last 100 years, it's really been an overwhelming bias. Everything I find, first and foremost, you got to get through all that. How the Bible is just folklore, it's just fictitious, and then they give you the real facts. So here's what the archaeological digs show. Well, it's not quite the way it is, because actually what they find in the records of the Canaanite people themselves, there's the terrible Hebrew people that invaded the land from the south. There's record of that, which is of course the Hebrews, but they were terrified of the terrible Hebrews, and this is pretty much downplayed and dismissed in most of the archaeological reports and findings, but there's still some biblical, to be noted as a biblical archaeologist is almost to be dismissed as ignorant and totally out of touch, you know, kind of like we are, you know, about saying, you know, but actually the findings in the excavation of Jericho is that there was a wonderful spring within the city for water supply, and they would have, this was in spring of the year when Israel came across the Jordan and came against Jericho. It was right after the barley harvest, the winter barley, so the barley had been gathered in. So to lay siege to a city like this, double walled, with their own water supply and their own food supply, to lay siege to this city would have, to be successful, would have probably taken years, because those people could have held out for that long, 2, 3, 4 years, maybe a little longer, because they had enough resources to survive that long. Joshua chapter 6 verse 1, I think the Hebrew people surrounded the city, and nobody came out or went in. It said, I mean, it was shut up. It was a regular siege, but they didn't have to have anything. So this could have went on for a long period of time. Now, the archaeological dig, or the archaeological findings show that the walls definitely did fall down. That's apparent. Can anybody recount kind of the events that happened with the conquest of Jericho? What did God command? I think it's chapter 6 there. What was his instructions?
They marched around the city with blow trumpets.
Okay.
Or does that matter?
6 days, right?
Yeah, 6 days.
The first 6 days, march around at once, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what was they going to do on the 7th day?
6 times. First 7.
7 times. And they blow the trumpets, and then the people are to what? Shout, and the walls would come down. Before that, the people had nobody to say a word, everybody be quiet. But on the seventh day, after the seventh round around town, shout, and the walls come down. Now that is what the evidence shows. These earthen, or the mud brick walls collapsed and come down. And really, it was just kind of just formed kind of a ramp up into the city. You know, just climb right over the rubble, and you're right in town. And the people were around it, it said every man just went straight away, didn't they? Just wherever you were, you could just go right into town. Now before, you know, you had walls here, you were well over 50 feet high. And the first wall and the second wall, it was formidable. This is gonna be incredibly impossible almost to take. Another bit of interesting evidence on the north wall, if this was kind of north and south here, on the north wall there's a small section of this outer wall that did not collapse. So that's probably where Rahab's home was. And also from this northern wall to the mountains, to the Judean mountains, for the two spies to hide, like Rahab told them, was not too far of a distance. It would have been very possible to make that run, you know, for them to hide in the mountains until the search was over. Also, the evidence is that the whole place was just burned. Just, that's what God told them to do, wasn't it? Burn it. They still find the remains of burnt grain. There's a vast storage of burnt grain, storage jars. If it was plundered, those would not have been left. That grain was valuable food source. It would have been taken, used as food, used as a commodity to trade, or whatever else. Anybody that would have done that, they wouldn't have left that. They wouldn't have burned it. That was God's command to burn it. So the evidence and archaeological evidence confirms the biblical account in Jericho. You don't hear too much about that from the modern archaeological society we have today. But there it is. I mean, it's just, it's kind of, I mean, our archaeological understanding is somewhat limited. We're digging back in thousands of years, and we have to be, I think, very careful. I think sometimes people, our archaeologists get a little ahead of themselves and a little more overconfident. And there are things that we just can't quite understand, but all the evidence shows that it's just like what happens in the Bible, what is told in the Bible. What did God command concerning the people? Of Jericho.
You wasn't supposed to keep anything for yourselves.
There was, yeah, there was no spoil of any type. But what about the inhabitants of the people, the inhabitants of Jericho? Kill them all, right?
Men, women, young, and old.
From the aged to the newborn infant, men, women, and children. I mean, complete. Livestock, animals, pets. Anybody had a pet hamster? Gone. With the sword. This was complete. That sounds like pretty tough business, because it is pretty tough business. And a lot of times you'll hear that somebody say that, well, the God I worship wouldn't do that. And that might be true, depending on which God you worship. But the God of the scriptures, Jehovah, that which I have described before as that mysterious, austere desert God of the Hebrew people, he's the same as said, suffer little children come unto me. He's the same that wept to tomb. He's the same that wept over Jerusalem. He's the same that fed the 5,000. He changeth not. The Jesus that walked the face of the earth and that is with us here today, this is him, right here. Because he's the same, he isn't any different. He said, go in there and you kill everybody. Everybody. Don't leave anybody, anything left alive. Everything or anything that breathes is to be put to the sword. So if we can kind of borrow one of Ron's phrases, let's pick this apart. I always like to hear him say that because usually we're going to learn something. So if we can kind of steal that phrase from him and get away with it here, we'll see what we can do with it. Again, I think we read this last week, but again in chapter 2, verses 9, 10, and 11, this is Rahab speaking. And she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what ye did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we had heard these things, our heart did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heaven above and in the earth beneath. Now I think at this point in time, Rahab was a very young woman. In our eyes, not much more than a girl. She had heard and learned all this from her parents, from her grandparents, from the whole community. They all knew. They knew what had happened at the Red Sea. Now the Egyptians did not broadcast this. This was an extreme embarrassment to them. But that didn't make any difference. Word still got around. Everybody knew. And they knew what had happened after the Red Sea. They knew of battles and that Israel had and with Joshua in leadership against these other kings. They knew, they would have known really everything that had happened during the 40 years of Israel's wanderings. They would have known of the successes and the high points, and also the failures and the judgments that have come upon Israel. You have the tabernacle. You have the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. They would have known, and they did know. We have that evidence in Rahab's testimony here. Excuse me. Now, what I've read in diaries and military journals and in reports and things from the Old West, and going way back to the time of Lewis and Clark, even before, when there just really wasn't anybody but the tribes out here west of the Mississippi. It was almost impossible for anybody to come out here for any length of time and remain unknown. I mean, that their presence was unknown. You wouldn't think you could come out here. I mean, the land is empty, it's vast. You could slip through here and nobody would ever know you were here. You couldn't be out here too long and somebody would figure out you were here. And that's been verified many times. I mean, you'd think just other than a few bent blades of grass, there's no evidence of your ever being here. But if you come out here, you know, and people did, just to roam around, look a little bit, or trap, or just see what was out here. There was a few individuals and a few small parties, and pretty soon the tribes knew about it, or anybody else who was out here. They figured out somebody was out here, and they pretty much knew what he was up to. Now you contrast that with back to the Israelites, a couple million people or so. Everybody knew. So these Canaanite people were informed, and they knew what had happened, and they knew about the Red Sea. They knew the miracles that God had performed for the Hebrew people, and they were terrified. But as it stated in the New Testament, straight as gate and narrow is the way, and few that be there that find it. Rahab is one of the few that understood what this meant, and everybody else rejected it. They were terrified, but they did not turn to God. They did not turn that this was the real God. She says, for the Lord your God, He is the God in heaven above and earth beneath. He is God. You see, when we tend to say, well, the God that we worship wouldn't do these terrible things. It's pretty easy to have the tendency to create God after our own image. We fashion our God that we worship as we want Him to be, which is just exactly what the pagans did. They fashion out of gold and silver or stone or wood. They make their God just exactly like they want, and then they fall down and worship Him, and they expect Him to deliver them. And we can kind of do the same thing. We kind of pick and choose what attributes we want our God to have, and we ignore the reality of Scripture. It tells us who He really is. So, really, when Israel came to the land of Canaan 40 years prior and refused, and they sent in as 12 spies, and they refused to go across Jordan and refused to take possession of the land then, their refusal and their disobedience bought the Canaanites 40 years of grace, a grace period. And that's just exactly what Israel's refusal at the cross bought us. Well, it's been more than 40 years, it's been about a couple thousand now. But the Canaanites received 40 years grace because of Israel's disobedience, and the world has received at least a couple thousand years of grace because of the Israelites, because of Israel's disobedience and rejection at the cross. We can see what Rahab did with it. It was to her eternal benefit. And it didn't do the rest of them much good. And that's kind of the way, that's the position we find ourselves in. We've offered this time of grace because of Israel's refusal. What are we going to do with it? Well, most do just like the Canaanites did, just if the world takes a serious, honest look at the return of Jesus Christ, in the day of judgment, they're terrified, but they don't turn to Him. Just like the Israelites, or just like the Canaanites, they were totally terrified, but they didn't acknowledge God but Rahab did. Another point I want to get across here before we get out. So, what did the two spies do? What did they say to Rahab when she let them down? When she hit him, she sent the authorities the other way, and then she let them down the window and give them instruction on what to do. What did they say unto her?
Your lives for your lives. That part with love.
What did they tell her what to do?
Don't
What?
go outside.
Oh, yeah.
You fine?
Don't go outside.
Okay. Something else.
Go to the court.
Scarlet cord. It appears like that's the one she let them down from the window from. And they said, what? Bind that in her window? You notice they didn't bind it in the window for her. She had to do that herself. And they give their word. They give their word. Now they were commissioned by Joshua to go on this mission. When they give their word to Rahab, that was the same as Joshua giving his word. He understood that once they got back to camp. he understood, and they understood, they all understood what the situation was. When they give their word, Joshua understood that was the same as him giving his word. They were acting under his command, and Joshua was acting under God's command. This was the same as the word of God to Rahab. He says, this is the deal. You stay in the protection of your home with the identification of that star cord, and you're all right. But you go out, bad news. She also secured this promise for her family, didn't she? Remember anything else like that in the New Testament? Acts 16, 30, 31. What must I do to be saved?
Lord Jesus Christ, you shall be saved, you and your family.
Okay. If we understand a little bit about the Old Testament, that clarifies that in the New Testament. That doesn't mean automatic salvation for your family. Just like it didn't mean automatic salvation for her family here. She had to get them in. This was the only place that was safe. But she had to get them in here. Now when the Hebrews come in through town, and there was a girl out there that says, well, I'm Rahab's sister. Well, that's nice. She's Rahab's dead sister. And just a flash of a sword. She had to be in that house with that scarlet cord bound in the window. That's the only place it was safe. And that promise was good as long as the qualifications were met. And just, the promise for our family to be saved is good too. As long as we bring them to Jesus Christ, we bring them into the protection of the blood. The Old Testament clarifies the New Testament a little bit. It gives some background so that we understand. So, we're about out of time. Do we listen to the music or what? Till when they quit, we quit. Is that how it works? But is that clear? What?
Yeah, because I've always wondered, because everybody always just says the first part of Acts 16:31, believe on the Lord Jesus
Yeah.
Christ and you will be saved, not the you and your household, or not the.
That gets a little tricky.
Right.
The last
so-
three words.
Uh-huh. So that
The
helps.
same way with Rahab's family. I mean, she was under the obligation to tell them, hey,
Yeah,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you come in, you'll be all right. But they had to make the choice.
to come.
And it's just like us for salvation, we have to make the choice. I mean,
And as
we get
parents-
told that, and as Acts would say, you and your household, if you're saved, you've got the responsibility to tell them,
Right.
but they still have to make that choice.
I just don't picture Rahab being physically capable of dragging her whole household in there.
Especially
This
if
little
you're
girl goes out there
young.
and you're coming, like it or not. Grab hold of them, throw them inside. I don't think so. She had to persuade them that this is the thing to do. This is the only place that's going to be saved. And if they didn't come, they weren't going to be saved.
Well, and chances are, she would have had to have been really persuasive because of her lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I personally, if that was my daughter, I would not agree with her lifestyle. And I would have had a really hard time with,
Oh.
taking her word and
Right.
going with it, but they
Right.
still had to make that choice.
Is this kid telling the truth? Is this the way it is, or is she high on something? What's
Yeah.
going on here? And we might also draw some similarity to Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot tried to persuade his other daughters and his sons-in-law to escape, and they wouldn't pay any attention to him. That's somewhat similar. Before we close here, why did God give the command, if we can understand it all, even a little bit, why did God give the command to kill everybody? Kill them all. And this wouldn't be the only instance of that. This would be the norm,
Keep from corrupting the Israelites.
okay?
They're completely against God. It's kind of like the radical Muslims, kind of, you know, they want to kill you. They're going to kill you.
About 600 years or so before this, God called Abraham out of this. And with the plan that he was going to build a people, a nation for himself, be wholly his own, and then he was going to use that nation for a witness to the rest of the world, and ultimately brings the Savior through that nation. But he was not willing to spend 600 years and do all that he did, bring Abraham out of that, and then throw him right back into that mess. And that's what this was exactly what he had brought him out of. That pagan religion that come from Babylon, which is right over there, land where Abraham came out of. It was the same thing. We can see that they had 40 years to think about this, and they didn't come around, and they weren't going to come around. And God commands his people to be separate. Be ye separate. Kind of tough sometimes, but he expects his people to be different, and you immerse yourself in this, and you're not going to be much different very long, are we? We're going to be just like everybody else. We usually don't aspire to raise ourselves up. We kind of like drag everybody else down to our levels for all the same. And God understood this, and he did some pretty harsh commands here. Tough business, but he knew what he was doing. Even if we don't quite understand it, and it seems incredibly hard, which it is.
Is that maybe like a picture of the second coming when, you know, the
Well,
blood
yes.
runs bridle?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
always
I'm
been
glad you
that.
brought that up, because I thought about that, when in Revelation, we see Jesus Christ mounted horseback, and his entire vesture soaked with the blood of his enemies. This doesn't sound like the same guy says, several little children coming to me, you know, it is, he's the same one. But, his tolerance level for, sin just doesn't exist. If it did, there'd be no hope. We'd never overcome. We'd always be sick and dying, and there'd be no end. So, anything else?
Did cord color have any significance?
Scarlet?
Yeah.
Well, we think it does, because, I mean, it makes it easy for us to draw the comparison between the scarlet cord and the red blood of Christ, and the red blood of any sacrifice in their time too, that God commanded, but specifically the red blood of Christ. I think last week we said that with the flax on the roof, that she probably made linen too, and then she would have dyed that, and scarlet dye would have been, I mean, this would have been part of her livelihood, and so the scarlet cord would have been a common thing in her household, and there it was, and they used that. But that scarlet cord was the only thing that stood between her and death. She had to put that in the window. Nobody else did it for her. She had to be responsible. She was responsible for doing that. And that was the only thing, the one and only thing that saved her. Just like the blood of Jesus Christ is the one and only thing that saves us. Nothing else. Nothing else will do. So everybody understood when they went into the city, you see the scarlet cord, you leave that alone. Everybody was under that obligation. Judgment did not come to her house.
Lord, for this day, just thank you for this time we have together. Praise you and Lord, that you